Welcome to Commercial Real Estate Now in partnership with CBRE Econometric Advisors and my co host, Dan Diebel. I'm Carly Iacono. Dan, great to see you again. Another month, another interesting episode. How are you?
I am doing fantastic. There's chaos and swirl everywhere it seems right now, but I'm surprisingly calm right now. I love a little bit of chaos in my life. So just wading through it, enjoying spring here in Portland because everything shuts down in Portland during the winter time and like everybody gets really cozy. Famously, I enjoy it when or infamously, I should say, I enjoy it when it gets dark early. I feel like I get to settle in and do like really hard work. And then when the sun is out, like I want to be outside doing stuff. So I like the winter time because that's when I like settle in and do deep thinking and stuff. But now that the sun is out, I want to be outside and doing stuff. So I love it. I'm in a great mood, excited to be here, excited to talk all things economy.
So you are basically happy every season is what I just get out of that. Because you started by saying you were so happy it was spring, and then how much you loved winter came right after that. So unless you hate summer and you're the only person in the world who hates summer and fall, you're just happy you're around. That's amazing.
I guess I am. Oh my, what a great realization. What a great way to start. I do
Just
love
a
summer.
generally positive economist. That's what we like.
I would
Nice.
not say some other people would describe me as that, but yeah, all right, let's go with it. We're gonna run with generally positive economist.
We're just here unpacking reality, and
Yeah.
that's a good groundwork. So amidst all of this chaos, we are going to try to tackle tariffs because that is all anybody's talking about, frankly, and we would be remiss not to weigh in on it again because it is ever changing. Now, we're not publishing this episode for a few days. So, to everyone listening, this situation, as you know, is changing. I don't even think it's day to day. I feel like it's hour by hour. So, in 4 or 5 days from now, there could be some disclaimers at the bottom of this episode saying, just kidding, everything we said is not happening, or it is happening, or it's happening twice as strongly, or quarter as strongly as we thought. So, you know, it's a day by day discussion, but we're going to give it our best.
Yeah.
Is that
So
enough disclaimers for you or no?
I mean, there are never too many disclaimers. As an economist, there are never too many disclaimers.
Fair.
But I would say, the last episode we did on tariffs 4 months ago, when they were first brought up on a Joe Rogan podcast, of all things.
It's where we always get our news and data. No, just
Right,
kidding.
exactly, of course.
Not at all.
The day after we recorded that, they changed their statement on
Right.
tariffs, and I was like, "Oh, okay." So yeah, all
This
of
is
the
how it's going to
disclaimers,
go.
but I think everybody that's going to listen and tune in is going to be at least aware of the, you know, constantly changing policies around tariffs that this administration is currently experiencing.
I think absolute chaos is a more accurate way to say it. But yes,
Yes.
constantly changing is a diplomatic way to say it. Yes. So instead of outlining where we are numbers wise on tariffs and going country by country, I think it makes more sense to talk broadly about what industries could be affected by tariffs because that will help shape investment decisions as this unfolds. And then also some of the pros and cons of tariffs. There are a lot of cons, but there's also some pros, and I don't think those are being discussed. So it's important to bring that up as well. So why don't we start going industry by industry with some changes, some effects that we could see if tariffs continue as they currently are in theory being presented. So, do you want to kick us off with pharma? That's a big one.
Yeah. So pharma is a big one, and I know I definitely don't want to get into the numbers here, but the tariffs on China seem to be sticking. And that is a huge pharma producer. Even though most of the large pharma companies are based in the United States or do production in the United States, a lot of the molecules that are developed and patented, that's correct, they patent the actual molecules themselves. Like we're inventing
Interesting.
molecules when we're
Hmm.
inventing pharmaceuticals. That's done in China. And they develop these new molecules that are then licensed to pharmaceutical companies. And then the pharmaceutical companies produce their pharmaceutical goods from them. And a lot of that is done in China. So these tariffs are going to raise the prices of those. And, you know, as I would say, most Americans are aware of, uh, the pharmacy is already a very expensive place to go. Uh,
Right.
that can be quite hefty on the pocketbook. So we look at those expenses are probably going to get higher. And that is an industry that's very difficult to replicate. Not
Right. You
only
can't just
on the
bring it
sorry,
to the
not
US, right? And start making a generic version of the drug or the same drug under a new name because of all of these patents, correct?
so yes and no.
Okay.
Um, the patents are an issue. The intellectual property is certainly an issue. Um, but the tariffs, I don't believe so far will affect that. In fact, the one of the things that the US does a lot of is services. And it's very difficult to levy tariffs on services, just like it's difficult to levy tariffs on intellectual property. One of the things that the Obama administration did was attack some of the Chinese theft of American intellectual property.
Hmm.
And pharma kind of goes the other way, where the US licenses the intellectual property from these Chinese companies that are inventing molecules, not necessarily the drugs themselves, but the molecules that then go into producing the drugs.
So you can't
Again,
replicate the drug if you can't use the molecule, I would
right.
assume.
Yeah.
Got it.
We can't make the drug, you can't make the drug without using the molecule. And the molecule discovery happens in China. They're very good at it. They're very
Mm.
effective at discovering, inventing these new molecules. So
Hmm.
we don't currently have the knowledge base, so the human capital to investigate those, nor do we have the laboratories set up in the United States to bring that part of the pharmaceutical process over to the US.
It's really
So,
a twofold hit then, right? The R&D side, we can't make our own molecules with any sort of efficiency or speed, and we also don't have the facilities, which I would imagine are quite complicated and expensive to build, especially with all the different licenses and so forth. So that's a real problem. Am I right that at the same time there's talk of reducing funding to research as well in the US? So that could be almost like a triple whammy there.
yes, 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 and yes. So yeah, triple
Ugh,
whammy. You are correct
okay,
on all fronts there. I now again, this could change. Yesterday or
right.
maybe 2 days ago now, Trump froze federal grants for research. And I believe it was a blanket freeze, or that's what I read. Again, sometimes these come out
Right.
and they are totally different. You know, the 90-day pause on tariffs was, oh, there will be a 90-day pause. And the market pumped,
Yes.
absolutely
It was
skyrocketed.
yesterday. Right.
Yep. And then they were like, nope, we're definitely not going to do that. And it fell again. And
Right.
then now there is that 90-day pause, but who knows what's going to happen tomorrow, as we've already discussed. So,
It's
you know, everything
crazy.
with a grain of salt right now. Uh,
Mhm.
Currently, pharma's looking at a pretty serious degradation in their ability to perform their operations and research and develop new products, because we don't know how to research and develop the molecules that make these products. China is just better at doing it than we are at the present moment. And when you, I guess maybe this is a quadruple, when you start dismantling education and you
Mm.
start attacking the human capital that spurs innovation, that can hurt your long run growth.
It snowballs
Yeah.
for sure. I mean, that's the foundation. And I think it's so much farther reaching than just, oh wow, the drug companies aren't going to have the same offerings, or maybe their margins are a little bit tighter. But I would imagine this could affect insurance companies. It can affect all of our tenants who sell pharmaceuticals as part of their business or profit from that, which is more than just CVS and Walgreens and Rite Aid, right? There's pharmacies all over, Targets, independent pharmacies, like you name it, right? It's pretty broad. So I could see this being really a consideration if all these pieces kind of come together at the same time, and that the profitability of the drugs that we have is it's really in question. Or the prices just go significantly up, which of course is going to be an issue for consumers.
Yeah. And you bring up a
Well,
really
that's
good
great.
point that we don't need to necessarily dive into. We can dive into it in these other industries, is that even if the good itself is not taxed, right? So we grow, or let's make up a hypothetical. Georgia grows a lot of peaches. All right.
Okay.
They grow those peaches. They're grown in America. There's no tariff on peaches. But in order to grow peaches, you need water. Well, water we're not importing from China to grow peaches or elsewhere. So no tariffs on water, but most of the sprinkler parts not made in the United States.
Mm,
All of your input prices into goods even produced in the United States rely on other countries
right.
and what they produce. So, you know, it's not just these final goods that we're importing that are going to increase in price for the consumer. It's all goods, because most goods rely, at least in some part of their supply chain, on an imported good.
And I think that's a perfect transition to our next industry we want to cover, which is the auto industry. Because when I think of cars, right, hundreds, if not thousands of parts go into them. And I don't recall the stat, but I know that these components travel back and forth between countries just a dizzying number of times. It's not like you're just shipping the parts individually and then they're assembled in one place. It's like partially assembled and then shipped somewhere else, and then partially assembled more and then shipped somewhere else. So it's really a global process for a lot of manufacturers, and all of those parts coming from different areas and subject to potentially very widespread tariffs. We think that is going to be a significant concern for the dealers when they're selling the end product.
Yeah, absolutely. And now it's certainly that is the case. There is a lot of auto manufacturing in the United States. Um,
Completely though, no components come from other countries.
Absolutely not. that was
Okay,
that
I
was
was like,
that was
really?
certainly not to downplay your point. More that the US is not importing whole cars
Right.
on a level that many think. So, for instance, Toyota has a massive factory in the United States. They produce many of the cars that they sell in the US are produced in the United States already. So, even
Okay,
though they're not
that's
a
good.
US company, they're
Right.
doing their production here. So, like, the tariffs are going to come not in the final product of the import of that car, but rather, like you alluded to, all of these parts being shipped here, there. They ship it to Canada, and then we bring it over from Canada to our factory because Canada's better at building, um, I don't know, engine pistons or something. I don't actually know what
We'll give them
Canada
credit.
builds, but
I'm
yeah,
sure there's a long list. We're not dissing Canada. Anyone listening, Canada's great. I'm sure there's a lot of competitive advantage there. We just don't know what it is.
yeah, yeah. And I
Go
mean,
on, go on.
famously, right, the car manufacturers moved from Detroit across the border to Canada. Um, Boy, I that was a long time ago now. Maybe not a long time ago in the terms of history, but in terms of auto manufacturing, they much of the cars that we think of as American made are, of course, made in the Americas. Canada's part of North America, but they're no
Right.
longer made in the United States. So many of those companies move their factories across the border because Canada had a comparative advantage in creating automobiles, and shipping them that short distance was not as much of a burden. One of the positives of tariffs is that they can be used to protect infant industries. So if you have an industry that has a higher cost of production or a higher opportunity cost to produce a good than another country, you can put tariffs in place on that other country's production of that good to help your industry out
Competitive
its
advantage.
infancy
Yep.
and let it catch up.
Yeah. That makes complete sense.
Right.
So,
So, when those car companies were having discussions about moving to Canada to produce automobiles, that's when the US could have stepped in and effectively leveled tariffs to protect our industries. Coming in after the fact, when we've reached a historic level of globalization,
mhm,
creates chaos
right.
we have all seen.
Right. And I would imagine it's gonna create time delays and getting parts, like, that just as companies try to source different components of their individual, like, finished part from, new countries or new places. I would imagine the whole supply chain is gonna slow down. But before we go too much into pros and cons of tariffs, I wanna cover 2 more industries, and then we'll jump to our, I guess, thoughts on what could be good or bad, bigger scale. Why don't we touch on the IT industry? We've all gotten really used to cheap electronics, right? Big TVs that are a few $100s, iPhones. Well, iPhones aren't actually cheap, but we've all gotten used to using them, and electronics are just everywhere. I would imagine this is an industry that could be hit pretty hard from tariffs because a lot of it is manufactured overseas. What's your thought on the technology industry?
Yeah. So much of the technology is produced in China, and those tariffs are still in place. Apple, I believe, is looking at shifting their production of the iPhones shipped to the US to India right
Hmm.
now, or that was the latest that I had read.
Idea, yeah,
Again,
workaround.
lots of swirl right now. Um, oh yeah, and yes. So, much of the tech that we consume is produced in China and other Asian countries. With the relief on other Asian countries at present, I would expect to see, much like Apple has announced that they're attempting to do, a shift in production to India or other places with a labor force that can be used to produce iPhones, for instance. The CEO of Apple did say in uh, response to some questions that were handled by the president's press secretary around whether the United States could produce iPhones, he did indicate that at present we do not have the human or technological capital to produce iPhones within the US. So, you know, even if we wanted to do that,
Right,
it would take years to
right.
develop. Yeah.
And a huge expense to these companies, I am sure, trying to replicate a labor force in the United States to do all of these different jobs that are currently being done in China, Vietnam, and India. That is not going to be an inexpensive endeavor on top of actually creating and building these factories and assembly lines and plants. I mean, that's just an incredible undertaking. So it is not going to be a quick switch over. And with all of the instability of the tariffs, right? The day to day that we've been touching on, it's 125%, it's 80%, it's pause for 90 days, it's 40%, whatever, right? Every day is completely different. It must be very difficult to be in leadership at one of these companies and try to figure out how quickly you need to act. Because what if you start investing and everything changes again? That could really be a detriment to the bottom line and the profitability,
Yeah. And
I would think. I'm surmising.
absolutely. And I think you bring up a really good point here in that regardless of whether they start to act or not, they're going to start to form plans, whether it be looking for another country to produce in, to repatriate some of that manufacturing to the United States, or anything else. They're going to start to investigate ways to protect their margins. And not only are companies going to do that, countries are going to do that. Currently, the US imports a lot of, not to get off this IT thing too much, but
Yeah.
we import a lot of our technology from other countries that create it. You know, the CHIPS Act was meant to bring some of that production back to the United States. It looks like President Trump is dismantling that act, but also kind of shifting around some of where that money goes. So again, we're not quite sure how all of that's going to land. But companies and countries are going to start insulating themselves from exposure to these tariffs, be that through producing different goods, focusing on themselves. Maybe they're going to start, pushing more tech on their own countries or other countries around them that are open to trade still, and not imposing these barriers to trade. You already have seen China start reaching out and making allies using these tariffs as an excuse, like, oh, we'll import your products and we won't charge a tariff. In fact, we'll pay you a higher price than you're going to get from these other countries, even though a tariff is paid by the importer and not the country exporting it. There is some ability for large importers to impose some of the costs on the tariff on the producer of the good that they're importing.
So we might not even see the full effects of even just the tariff discussions for a decade. I mean, it's hard to say, right? If these countries are then just having these conversations and saying, we don't want this kind of instability in the future. So whatever happens today, we're going to deal with. But how do we create, like you said, new allies? How do we create more, self-sustainability, whatever their angle is? Those plans, even just being brought up and brought to the forefront as a necessity for conversation, is a change. And that could really lead to longer term implications that we have no idea how that will look down the road.
Yeah, I mean, yep. I
thought of that.
Canada got rid of their liquor stores. They just took American liquor off the shelf entirely. Now, if you're an American company,
it's a problem.
That's not good for you. But if you're a Canadian, you're just going to go and buy Canadian liquor and form that new habit. And moving forward, you're going to.
Right.
Yep. It's done. Like, some of this damage cannot be reversed, right? It's very easy to dismantle things. It's very difficult to build them, and even more difficult to rebuild them if they've been dismantled. So there are going to be lasting effects, and we don't know what those are going to be. Certainly, we didn't know the effects of globalization when it started. There were hypotheses, but we did not realize we were going to end up in a world where it's cheaper to make a good all the way across the world and then put it on a boat and ship it all the way to the United States than it is to produce in the United States. Like, if you were to tell that,
crazy if you think about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Even in the early 1900s, they would have been like, no, you're crazy.
No sense.
You're a crazy person. Yeah.
Right. So I just want to touch quickly on apparel, because that's another huge category. And then we'll finish up with our pros and cons and thoughts on the effects. I think we get most of our fast fashion from outside the US, like pretty much all of it is my understanding. So there'll be a lot of United States retailers who are, I'm not sure what their plan's going to be, right? Do they look to produce their private label brands elsewhere? Do they find new companies? I feel like apparel might be a harder category to have that consumer substitution or shift if the consumer can tell, right, a change in the goods.
Yes. So apparel and textiles, actually, like if we want to do a little bit of history, was where some interesting tariff history kind of started.
Okay.
And way, way back, like we're talking when tariffs were the main source of revenue for the government. So early 1800s, right after the foundation of the United States, before Congress even had power to tax the people, uh, they raised revenue through tariffs. And the first kind of large set of tariffs was to protect the American textile industry. After about 10 years, the way that America was producing textiles was so different from the way other nations were producing textiles. They were no longer substitutes for each other, so we didn't really need the tariffs.
Not usually a
Without getting
huge
too far
fan
down
of,
that rabbit hole,
yeah,
sorry.
I was gonna say, I'm not usually a huge fan of like very far back historical references, but that is very relevant, I think, because you just brought up this perfect example that some things we just can't substitute. You get used to a certain fabric that is just not produced here, right? We don't have the raw materials, or we just don't have the manufacturing set up for it, and that is what XYZ product is made from. I
Yeah.
don't know all the ins and outs of that industry, but just maybe rayon or like a specific fabric that we just don't produce here, but that's widely used. So that is a great historical example. What did they do? What happened? What was the end game back then? And what do you think that will mean for today's times?
Yeah. So the end game back then was that they left the tariffs in place. They stopped raising revenue, and then eventually they eliminated the tariffs. And our textile industry over hundreds of years moved to China, and then most recently, with tariffs instituted on China, not underneath Trump, textile not underneath President Trump or the current administration, textile production and our apparel production moved to places like Vietnam and Bangladesh and other places in Asia that were outside of China. So when these reciprocal tariffs were announced, the apparel industry was going to get hit very hard because of the I hesitate to call it a mathematical equation. Like I should use air quotes here, a mathematical equation for reciprocal tariffs, which there's plenty of other people that can describe that to you and how odd it was to decide. But it would hit apparel particularly hard because somewhere like Vietnam, where we import a large amount of apparel from and don't export very many goods at all to, would have a very high tariff levied on them, or we would pay, I apologize, we would pay a very high tariff for importing apparel from that country, which would then skyrocket prices. And the way that apparel was moved to that country was to avoid tariffs in the first place. And when you
Right.
levy tariffs on all the other countries, you can no longer avoid them. And that is very true in the apparel space and would harm retailers, sorry, would harm apparel retailers. Your
Right.
discount retailers would probably be protected. Many of your value retailers sell American made goods, although they do again import some of their supply chain along the way. Some of the things that go into producing the goods ultimately are imported. It wouldn't harm them as much as apparel, where we are importing the final good, and the final good is the tariff is directly levied on that final good.
So is there going to be a workaround? What do you think? What's the apparel industry's answer to this? Or what strategic plans could they be putting in place that might help cushion this blow? I don't know. Any ideas on that? Seems pretty
Boy,
challenging.
I mean, I know that the CEOs of all these companies have been calling me and asking that very same question. Like, what do we do, Daniel?
Come
You're
on,
so
Dan.
good at this.
I
You
figured.
know, they're all looking for ways to avoid it, and I think most of it has been through appeals. You know, when the tariff discussion started, these companies stayed very quiet. Their leaders stayed very quiet. And then when reciprocal tariffs were announced, many of these companies spoke up and were like,
Wait,
we're
wait. Yeah.
we're going to get hurt by this. Like, this is
Yeah.
going to hurt us a lot.
I
And
think
that's
the
sorry.
question is, are tariffs, are we talking about a change? And we don't know the answer to this. I'm not asking you for the answer, but I think that really the question is going to be, are we going to see a shirt go from $40 to $44, which is material, 10% change, right? But is that going to change consumer buying behavior? Is that going to affect people enough that they say, okay, I'm not going to buy this shirt now, which would be a bottom line impact to the retailer? And then we also don't know how much wiggle room these retailers have to pass on the tariffs or to absorb them, and what their strategy will be there, because they're going to want to maintain market share and maintain their consumer base, but also not crunch their margins too much to where they're not profitable. So that's going to be a really interesting equation, I think. And how the prices are passed on is going to, I guess, determine what that inflection point is from a I'm not buying it now because it's just too expensive.
Mhm.
And how much room do we have in most of our products in the US until consumers say, nope, actually, I don't need that. I don't know again where that inflection point is, but I think that's what is going to be material.
I, I that is going to be material. That's such a good pun.
Yeah.
I assume you didn't mean to
I teased for
layer.
you.
Yeah. And so I do think that that's a really great point. And larger companies are going to have some bargaining power and ability to pass off some of the cost of the tariffs to the producer of the goods. Smaller companies will be left out in the cold because they won't have that bargaining power. This is going to create more industry concentration in the apparel industry for those companies that are able to weather the storm of tariffs, if these tariffs do come into effect, of course. And that's going to affect consumer confidence and the variety that consumers get to experience. Beyond that, it's going to increase prices, which is going to harm the consumer's budget. Consumers are going to continue to save more as they are less and less able to purchase more and more goods. They're going to save more for the future, which is going to cause the overall purchases to go down, which could create a recession or, at least an economic slowdown. And the more that consumers believe there's going to be an economic slowdown, the higher the probability of an economic slowdown. The self-fulfilling prophecy in economics is just amazing. Basically, if you believe it and enough people believe that the economy is going to be good, you can have a good economy. If you have enough people that believe that
Psychological
the economy
element.
is going to be bad, you can have a bad economy.
Right. Yeah, I love the psychological element to it. It's consumer behavior is fascinating.
Mhm.
So that was pretty bleak. I think you're right, unfortunately, right? If very high tariffs and reciprocal tariffs do end up coming online in a big way, like they are, and then are not being discussed, who knows? It could really have material effects. So we cannot end on a bleak note. So what are some of the positives of tariffs? And then we probably need to address a few more negatives too. But any positives? Why are we doing this as a country? Well, that's more of a political question.
Yeah.
Any positives from an economic standpoint that you see to tariffs?
I won't get into the political discussion of tariffs and political power or anything like that. But in terms of the positives of tariffs, as we mentioned earlier, protecting infant industry. So tariffs have been very effective in the past around protecting an industry that is valuable to have within your country. And that could be anything from car manufacturing, as we mentioned, to national security industries, right? Maybe we want to produce more computer chips in the US because we put them in everything that we use. And we would want control over that as opposed to a foreign national having control over our ability to interact with technology and the others around us and engage with it. You know, you can build a back door into computer chips to essentially spy on computers. And if another nation is doing that, again, I'm not saying that this is happening or anything like that,
Just
but if another nation
theoretically, right?
right. If some other nation is in charge of that, then,
The
maybe
risk. Yeah.
you're risking a little bit too much. So you might want to levy tariffs to give your industry some time to catch up.
So it's
Um,
almost like forced, I guess, rethinking of your process with tariffs, right? Saying like we can have these built elsewhere. This is before the extreme tariffs are put in place. But what if we could do it here? Maybe there's some long-term benefit to that, not just because now we're being forced to, but maybe there's long-term benefit to controlling the process. And I'm sure there's a lot of other examples in addition to computer chips, but that's a pretty clear one. So
mhm.
over time, right, changing the way we think of manufacturing could have some, I guess, stability, potential stability elements long term and security.
Yeah. And you don't even need, like, absolutely. And the national security and infant industry argument are the most common arguments. But
Hmm.
even if we look at the food supply chain,
It's a good one. We didn't even talk about that.
yeah, the US
It's a big
produces
one.
most of the world's corn. We produce way too much corn. And we
Yeah.
also produce a lot of soybeans.
Okay.
We don't eat a lot of soy. Corn is actually used in just about everything because we produced so much of it that the industry innovated and started putting corn in everything.
Right. Use it up. But soybeans, they didn't feel the same way about soybeans. So most of those are exported, I'm
Yeah,
guessing.
so we export a lot of the soybeans we produce. Now
Hmm.
soybeans are used in a lot of goods,
Of
but
course. Of course.
we export a ton of soybeans. Well, if you're not producing food in your country that you eat, and other countries are producing it way cheaper and then you're importing it, what happens if, I don't know, a ship goes down or something like that? Maybe you do want to tariff food, which raises prices on it, which is regressive, right? Uh, because tariffs are regressive, they tend to hurt lower income households more than they hurt higher income households. Any sort of tax on food also tends to be regressive. So if you put a tariff on food, it's going to be regressive, but it may protect and insulate the country against food shortages or,
Hmm.
you know, other issues that could be created through the supply chain of food, and we're not just talking avocado toast here, right? We import a lot of avocados. Um,
Well, that's a
but
tough example because a lot of things can't be grown here. I
yeah,
mean, like South America, right? We don't have even close to the same climate. So, I mean, outside of certain regions of California, I don't know where we're going to get our mangoes and coconuts and all of the tropical items that we enjoy, right? Because we don't have an option to grow it here. But you're saying for items that grow well here, maybe it's been cheaper to grow them elsewhere, but it wouldn't hurt us as a country to have some control of our own food supply for the high use items, which makes all the sense in the world.
right. And that can be a positive that comes from tariffs if they're levied in that way.
Okay.
Um, you can also use them as a bargaining chip, which has been done before. This is a very common presidential thing, never on this scale before. Um, but you levy tariffs against some good produced in a country in order to get some other outcome out of it. When you level them flatly on all countries, it's a little harder to bargain with every country at the same time.
You can try though,
Yes,
as we've seen.
you can try.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay,
glad that
so
I'm not trying.
bargaining power.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's an interesting angle. I mean, I could see that.
Yeah. Bill
And
Clinton
yeah.
just used the threat of tariffs to accomplish many of his goals.
Hmm. He didn't actually put them into place. That's interesting.
Yeah.
But it is a common tool, and it's funny. It's like with so many of these policies, I think the average American doesn't really think about it until something like this happens, and then that's all we're talking about for a period of time. But tariffs are not new. Basically, every president, to your point, has used them in some way as a tool to get done whatever it was they were trying to get done, whichever
Mhm.
way they were pushing. But this is not a new thing for presidents to be changing and talking about and bargaining over. Just perhaps not at this scale is the difference, right?
Correct. Yeah. And the last
Any other
time
any other positive? Sorry, go ahead.
oh, no, because I was about to say a negative, so,
Okay,
because
so we're done with positives. That was it. That's all we got for positives. Those are material. Those are some real ones, and they make sense. The infant industry one I thought was really interesting.
Mhm.
Because we have to be balanced, right? Like our independent news source that we are. What do you think about the negatives? I mean, we've already touched on some of them, but what have we not talked about, or what do you think we need to summarize on the challenges on tariffs?
Yeah, so, I personally, because, we're in commercial real estate, and in particular, I focused most of my efforts in the retail space and, like, kind of the auxiliary spaces around it. I focus on the consumer, and tariffs really hurt the consumer by raising prices. It hurts their balance sheets. And unfortunately, with the bout of inflation that we've just got through kind of fighting, consumers aren't in as we've discussed, consumers are not in a horrible place in the United States right now. They are just not as healthy as they were pre-inflation.
Right.
And you know that tariffs are going to raise prices and create some harm for the consumer. And that should be top of mind because America's strong consumer is what makes companies, retailers, institutions want to invest in the United States. So when you bring harm to the consumer, you're spreading harm throughout the economy in a much deeper way than just, oh, people have to pay more for things. And I think that that needs to be top of mind when you're thinking about tariffs. Not only are the local businesses paying the tariffs, either it's coming off of their margins or they're passing it on to the consumer, which means it's then coming off of the consumer's balance sheet. So,
Neither good.
yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully there are workarounds. Hopefully there are more positives than negatives. And maybe this won't be as extreme as everyone is talking about currently, or maybe they'll be paused longer than 90 days. We'll
Mhm.
see. It's definitely an interesting time with very far reaching implications. So we're going to have to stay on top of it and probably do another episode in the future when we have some more clarity. But for now, I think that was a great overview. I appreciate you going through those different industries and squeezing out a few pros along with all the challenges as well. Thanks so much, Dan.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. And I know that we kind of like ended on a little bit of a down, but we are in spring. The sunshine
Your
cannot be
favorite
tariff.
season,
Yep.
your second favorite season over winter. Okay, go
It's
on.
it's definitely my top four. Absolutely.
Fair.
Uh, the sun cannot be tariffed. Sunshine cannot be tariffed. Go out there, enjoy some sunshine, and soak it all in.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we're all going to be okay. It's just a little bit of chaos and turmoil, and it is important, like you said, to unplug, take a beat, realize like, the world will go on and we'll figure out all these different paths and the companies will find ways to evolve like, Americans always do. So it's good to keep it in perspective as well.
Mhm.
Agreed.
Yeah.
All right, that's a wrap. To everyone listening, that was this episode of Commercial Real Estate Now in partnership with CBRE Econometric Advisors. We're so happy you tuned in, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Have a great day, everyone.